Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Thomas, I'm one of this year's JPIT interns, and I work on our Constituency Action Network. Today's guest is Liz Wilson. Welcome.
Thank you.
Liz is the Vicar of St Anne, St Paul and St Augustine, Leicester, Area Dean for the City of Leicester Deanery, and the Vice Chair of Leicester Diocese Board of Education. She has a background in museums, beginning as a museum attendant and working her way up to manager for collections, interpretation and learning at Leicester Museums. As a parish priest, Liz's particular interests include creation care, developing worshipping opportunities for children and families, and supporting a foot care project, a community allotment, and messy church within her two church communities. Liz describes herself as a feminist, is committed to supporting the inclusive church network, and in her spare time enjoys being creative, making jam and chutney to be sold at the church fair. Brilliant. Great to have you.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
And joining us from JPIT today is Rue Stewart, Head of Public Issues for the United Reformed Church.
Always a pleasure, never a chore.
Brilliant. So, we'll ask the question, Liz, that we always ask our guests on Politics in the Pulpit, and there's no pressure in the way you answer this. Does politics belong in the pulpit?
I think the answer is yes. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have agreed to be your guest this week. As a local parish priest, I preach, regularly during the midweek and Sunday worships with all sorts of different congregations. So I'm very conscious that the way I preach changes depending on who I'm worshipping with. And so while preaching about politics does feature as part of my sermon writing and preparation, it's only one element of all the different things I'm trying to do, to encourage people to get to know God, to worship her, and to develop relationships. So it's one element of all the different things that I think I try and bring into my preaching, depending on the time of the year and the context and what's going on
Mhm.
locally, nationally, and internationally.
Great. Well, thank you. You've led very nicely into something we like to do next on Politics in the Pulpit, which is setting a bit of context, as you say, looking at some of the news headlines. And just a warning that we record this ahead of time. The news may have changed slightly, but I think all of these are definitely live issues. Recently, there has been an extra £5 million pledged by the government for patrolling places of worship after Islamophobic and anti-Semitic attacks in Britain. While Pakistan is gearing up to welcome American and Iranian delegations for more expected talks, the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah will continue. In Hungary, the opposition has decisively defeated Viktor Orban's Fidesz party, which has been in power for 16 years. And Britain's grid could run this summer without fossil fuels for the first time since 1882. There you are. And we'll just check that we've all got the same lectionary readings for this Sunday, the 26th of April. We've got Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47, Psalm 23, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 19 to 25, and John chapter 10, verses 1 to 10. And a little note that there is an ongoing trial of recommended adjustments to the Revised Common Lectionary to include more texts from the Old Testament to address the historic problem of anti-Judaism in Christian interpretation during Eastertide. If you'd like to look at more information, we'll link to this in the show notes as we have in other episodes in Eastertide this year. We also have a couple of awareness days, including World Malaria Day on the 25th of April and International Workers' Memorial Day on the 28th of April. So, with that in mind, let's have a look at the text. Liz, is there somewhere you'd like to start?
Well, I think the two texts I was particularly drawn to were the readings from Acts and also from Peter. In one of my churches, we only have two readings on a Sunday. The other, we always have four. And so at this time of year, I would definitely have to preach on Acts and the Gospel. But this time, it was the combination of the Acts and the Peter that really drew me because of the juxtaposition between them. In the Acts reading, you get this moment of what feels like perfection in the early church, when, the apostles and the early believers were gathering together, they were praying together, they were breaking bread together. And then that's that phrase, they held all things in common, which is always a very challenging phrase. And then you contrast that with the words of Peter in his letter, which is written particularly to those in a household situation where they actually have very little power, and are subject to other people's whims and wills.
Mm, great. Yeah, I'm very happy to start with the Acts. I think that's particularly interesting. Um, is there any other reflections you'd like to add, Liz?
Um, I suppose when I was reading this, I'm always very mindful that as a church, we're often drawn back to this particular reading at the very beginnings of the early Christian church community, because it does feel like something that we have then continued to aspire to get back to. Every generation reads this particular passage and tries to work out what it means for them. And so it's always a piece of scripture that I kind of really wrestled with, because it does feel like a really perfect moment. But actually, the reality of living, as we see from, I suppose, from the rest of Acts and the letters, that actually the reality of living in a Christian community, how that works out, how our faith works out, isn't necessarily as easy and as glorious as it appears in this particular reading. And the passage, or the phrase that often catches me out, is about bluntly the disciples holding all things in common. And we often think very much that that's about our possessions, but I don't think it really is just about possessions. It's more about, the way we hold stories in common, our plans in common, our purposes in common. It's about time and talents as very much as well as the treasures, the earthly treasures that we hold.
Hmm. Rue, do you have any particular reflections on the Acts passage?
I had also underlined in red that line. I mean, it's a key line, it's a key verse. The word before it, I was just actually looking online to try and get a little bit of understanding about the Greek. It's always good to do that. Depends where you look for your Greek, of course. I'm not a Greek scholar. Um, but it wasn't very helpful. It kind of just talked about together as being, this is from Strong's, and I know a lot of people criticize Strong's, but it's free and it's online, so that's what I use. You people who've got better access to better translations can work it out better. But it's really just talking about being a preposition, together as a preposition, rather than that kind of sense of togetherness. So it's kind of just using it along the way to help understand the rest of it. But I think it's still a really important word. I like that the NRSV uses that word together in there. All who believed were together and had all things in common. And that was the kind of the draw for me as well, Liz, was that idea that it wasn't just about the things, about the stuff, but
Mm.
there was a real sense of corporate unity and a shared unity. What surprised me a little bit again then is in verse 46, and it talks about the pattern that they had, where they would spend much time together in the temple.
Mm.
So for us, sometimes as maybe people who identify as Christians, identify as maybe Protestants, some of us identify as Reformed, some of us don't. There's all these kind of different definitions that we have that mark us out as different or separate or other from
Mm.
everyone else, and we kind of retreat into our own little spheres. But the idea that these were the fresh new Christians discovering what Christianity would mean for them, they still went with the traditional patterns that they already had of going to the temple. The temple was still the place where they would meet together. They didn't shun that history, they didn't shun that tradition, but they found new meaning in it, and they went from there and exercised their faith in new and vigorous, fantastic, exciting new ways. And I think there's something really beautiful around that expression of faith. That sometimes when we have some kind of revelation in our own lives, as people who minister, or even within our congregations, sometimes we're quite tempted to draw away from all of the old stuff and rejecting that and saying it's all bad, none of it's good. But here were people who were establishing a new way of being, a new life together, but they did it in the context of the familiarity, maybe in the security
Mm.
of what they already knew, but they didn't shun it. They went from there and did something with it. It's interesting that we're trying to rediscover some of the Hebrew Testament readings around Easter in some of our traditions, and to not just rely on the Acts ones, but there's still a lot in Acts that points us towards what came before as well. It's not
Mm.
all new and fresh, but it's a reworking, a redevelopment, a rethinking around those things. And as someone who works in the Reformed tradition, I think we're very confident and very happy to be rethinking and reforming all the time. It wasn't just a one-off thing, but we're rediscovering what that might mean. The other thing that I've underlined there is the goodwill of all the people. It's really important. We are coming up to, in a few weeks' time, this is not a plug, but it kind of is, 1 million acts of hope. So from the 13th to the 20th of May, we're inviting churches and all kinds of groups that are serving their communities and working with their communities, to really make a big noise about how much good stuff there is happening in our country that works around a sense of unity, that works around togetherness, that we are building community together. And it's really key there that we don't just exist for the good of our own members, we exist for the good of those who are not our members. And in our churches, we are working daily, day in, day out, with our buildings or outside our buildings, to create that kind of sense of community, that sense of togetherness. And it's not just for us. It's for the benefit of everyone. There are no borders and barriers where that's concerned. Our doors should be open, our walls should be knocked down, to those people who want to be part of community and that we're trying to serve. So there's so much packed into those few verses, isn't there, about how we should then live as Christians in a wider community, from the history that we have into the future that we have with others who don't identify the same way that we do, but we still have some good news to share with them and with ourselves.
Thank you both. Yeah, I'll ask you a quick question before we move on to 1 Peter. In light of this discussion about communities and inclusive communities, what does it mean for our mission? How do we do justice focused and justice seeking mission, do you think, in our church communities? I'm struck by verse 46, eating food with glad and generous hearts. How do we know what we've got and then share it on straight away to be glad and generous? How do we do that in our communities?
I think for me that some of that goes back to sort of what's going on with the church community at this time, and as a former museum creator, kind of where we've come from and the stories that we tell about ourselves, including our Christian and Hebrew scripture stories, are very much all part of that. And here you see a community very much living in the spirit, and the thanksgiving that then they give for each other, for God, for the food that they share, is very much a reflection of those spiritual gifts, spiritual responses. And I'm sure there's plenty of, them, thinking about kind of Galatians and so forth springs to mind at that point. But of course, one of the things that I was, what I was drawn to some of those lines about, holding all things in common, is actually how, in every generation, Christians have, and we continue to work tirelessly to actually make that a reality in our present age, whenever our present age happens to be. So, one of the organisations, for example, I support is the Mothers Union. I'm a member of the Mothers Union. It's a very Anglican thing to do. But one of the things I love about that is that the Mothers Union is about empowering women to work in their own communities to change the lives of families wherever they are. And so we can see, women, who are members of that worldwide Anglican organization, doing the bread and butter stuff of teaching other women how to read, how giving them numeracy so that they can actually lift their own children out of poverty. And so that the work that we do, in Leicester, which is where I'm based, supporting the Mothers Union, actually has direct world impact across the world, just from, us locally and our sisters and brothers in other places being part of that tireless sharing of our possessions, sharing of our knowledge, sharing of our talent, sharing of our learning to lift people out of the injustices, the poverty, and the challenges that they face locally. So I see that living in the spirit happens, not just here in my corner of the UK, but also how it's being lived out by Christians across the globe. It's the joy of having a global Christian family, is that in each of our local places, we are trying to live out that collective, shared, spirit-filled generosity that we see the early church doing.
Ruth, would you like to come in on this?
I was thinking thank you, Liz. I think it's really helpful. And I love the Mothers Union as well, having worked a
Good,
lot
I'm
with
pleased
them.
to hear
Great,
it.
great, great bunch of people. But not actually allowed to be a member, but maybe one day, maybe one day.
Women and men are both allowed to be a member, so, but I don't know whether there's an issue with the United Reformed Church and the Anglicans at that point. I'm sure there are plenty of things we could find to divide us at this point, and that's not the purpose.
Brilliant. I was thinking one of the practical ways that some churches are addressing this, and there's many ways that we're doing this. It is a daily occurrence that our churches are supporting communities. But I was thinking of one of the bigger projects that some churches are involved in is around affordable housing. And I think it really connects so well with this big ask of what do we do with those kind of shared possessions? So, a church building in itself, is a statement of, the investment of, community, a whole community, working for years and years to create this building, this edifice in which worship can happen, but all kinds of activities can happen. And churches that are reassessing that and thinking, well, how could we use our building or how could we use our land in a different way that serves the community and the needs of the community right now? And, verse 45 has that line, as any had need. And that might mean that our churches really need to think differently about how do we serve the needs? And I'm conscious about using the word "the needs" of a community. It creates some impression of we're the saviors of the community. Sometimes we reframe that and we say, what are the gifts and the graces of a community that we can work alongside and work with? And I think that's a much more positive way of looking at it. But looking at our communities, are our buildings and our land serving the best needs of the communities at the minute? Working with them, or do we need to rethink how we use that land and how we use those buildings? And so some churches have taken really strident steps to rethink that and are building housing on their site. They've knocked down maybe an old building that was dilapidated and was costing too much money to run, and they've created something much better, which maybe involves a community hub, but also creates space for land for living. Certainly within some areas of London, that's a really key thing where there's a big shortage of housing, but that happens all across the country as well. So there's one practical example, one huge project, one scary way that churches might want to take this passage seriously and think about using the resource that they have in common for the good of those within the wider community as well. So there's a challenge for some people to think about.
As you say that, I'm reminded of because when Thomas introduced me, he mentioned the foot care project that I supported locally, and that was a project led by my associate priest, who's also a podiatrist. And we set that up for my smaller church, which is in an area of deprivation, where people came and had their toenails trimmed and their calluses looked at. but within the Lady Chapel of that church. And the way that we worked it was we got it paid for by donations. So those people who could afford to pay would put more money into the shared pot, and those people and the people who who were back to this word need again, but who really struggle to get their feet and maybe hadn't had their feet professionally looked at for a long time. Some people would literally count pennies into that pot. But that was, just locally one example of using the talent and skills of one of my colleagues. Once a fortnight, she would treat people, she trained volunteers, and the more wealthier members of my congregation financially would contribute to some of the people in that more deprived community, again, thinking about poverty and finances there, to have their feet cared for. And as you get older, if you don't look after your feet, it can be a real challenge.
Mm. Thank you both. That's I didn't expect to hear so much about feet on Politics in the Pulpit, but
We've got a bit of a thing about feet in our community because of my amazing colleague Sharon Andrews,
yeah.
who is a former podiatrist now and our associate priest.
Brilliant. More podiatrist priests we need. Let's pivot ourselves to 1 Peter chapter 2. Um, I, as you said, it's an interesting contrast to that Acts in some ways. What are your key reflections?
I mean, I was drawn to this, and I did a bit of, as you need to do when you get faced with a piece of scripture from the lectionary, because it sometimes can come out of context. I looked at the wider context of who Peter was writing to. And I was very conscious that this particular passage addresses household slaves. And then a bit later on, he particularly addresses wives. So I was looking at this within the kind of household context, those people who were disempowered and had, less ability to, have say over what their lives looked like. Because, I'm very conscious that actually, if you read this text, it can be used quite negatively against people because it's effectively saying that, you it's acceptable. This is a bad reading of it, but it's acceptable to receive a beating, physical violence from your master, even if you have behaved well. And in the context, I'm just thinking of, you know, um, the certain Caribbean countries, asking for reparations for the history of slavery, for which, as a white woman, I know that I continue to benefit from, and I, live in a community where I have privilege, whereas my sisters and brothers of a global majority experience racism. That feels very pertinent. But I also think about, human trafficking for modern slavery in terms of sexual slavery, but also women and men who work within our very unequal economic communities, people in the gig economy or hours contracts, who are also in a way slaves because they are stuck in employment that actually is damaging. So I was just, really struck by the contrast between a church that is, seems to be in a good place, where the time and talents and resources of that community are shared. And then suddenly Peter is telling somebody at the bottom of society to accept a beating as part of their household. Actually really freaks me out in one sense. And so I did want to spend some time wrestling with that, because when scripture does challenge us, and when we find things that are really hard, we need to work out why that's hard and what God might be saying to us through these particular passages.
Thank you. That's a really helpful bit of context as well in thinking about sort of contemporary slavery in quite a literal way, and thinking of perhaps a national or United Nations understanding of what trafficking slavery is, but also the kind of slavery of the wage, you might say, of having to work. Rue, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, Liz, there's so much to unpack on that and what you said. I think sometimes an easy reading of this is to take it to the sort of the Enid Blyton level. And I don't mean that disrespectfully to anyone who's trying to preach on this because it's difficult. But sometimes, the easy way of understanding this is that, oh, that'll make sense in a preach, and it can be the easy way to go. And it probably does this. Well, it certainly does this a disservice. There's a temptation here to think about, well, the message is that, life is tough, but it'll all be worth it in the end. And I think that's probably true. And I don't think that scripture teaches us different from that, but that's not what people sometimes need to hear. And it's actually quite unhelpful for people who are really struggling at the minute. I don't want to just tell them, don't worry, it will get better. I mean, that might be helpful for some things, but I also want to be able to put my arm around someone if they would like it, and to say, we're here with you in this. And that we're not going to leave you alone in this or forsake you in this, that you're very much still part of who we are. And we hear that suffering, recognize that suffering, and we want to put that right. And so, yeah, there's so much to unpack there. So thank you, Liz, for just, dropping that truth bomb in there. I think it's really important for us to go beyond the basic and the obvious thing there of it'll be all right in the end, and think about, well, actually, what does that mean for the people who are right in the thick of it? So I was trying to understand why in my translation here, the topic was, or the heading was, follow the shepherd even in suffering. It's a lovely, like, snappy title, and I was like, where's the shepherd? And they go, oh, it's verse 25, it's over the page, I didn't see it. So you were going astray like sheep, but now you've returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. And then I was like, okay, right, that's why Psalm 23 is in here, because it mentions the word shepherd. Did they try very hard to link these together? And then I was thinking, oh, right, maybe there's more that connects these than just that they both mention a shepherd. So it was about verse. If it's all right, host, I'll go to Psalm 23 a little bit, if that's all right. And it was verse 4 and verse 3. So verse 3 and verse 4, I suppose, in order, because it talks about he leads me in right paths. Or you could talk about paths of equity or paths of prosperity, in a positive way, I suppose, for his name's sake. And then, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you're with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And it kind of just struck me, the way it was laid out on my page, that right paths and darkest valley were right beside each other. And I was thinking, oh, does that mean that sometimes the right paths are in the darkest valley? Because we often we tell people that the dark valley is the bad place. We don't want to go there. Keep away from it at all costs. But actually, maybe God is leading some of us through darkest valleys, which are the right paths for us to be on. And that feels odd to some people, and it feels very difficult as well. How do we preach on that? Maybe it's right that we go through the dark and the difficult thing, and maybe that's okay. Maybe God is with us even then. Maybe the community of believers are with us even then if we choose that way, or if we don't have a choice and we're still faced with that direction, maybe the shepherd is there with us. And then I went back to First Peter. If you can imagine my brain skidding around all of these. So First Peter 2 and then verse 24. And it's got a little bit of a verse there that we used to talk about all the time in my church growing up. By his wounds you have been healed, or by his stripes we are healed, is another way of rendering that. And there's all kinds of theology we could open up there, and all kinds of thinking around wounds and healing, stripes and healing, the healing of Christ for the healing of the nations, the hurting of Christ for the healing of the nations, and all those sort of things. There's a lot of things we could maybe go into, but in a 7-minute sermon or a 14-minute sermon on a Sunday, you might not want to go into all of those things. But I was really struck with that idea of sitting with those wounds and understanding those wounds and not moving on from those. That, those dark valleys, those dark paths do create wounds for us, and often the temptation for us is to skip ahead to the resurrection Sunday, to the redemption of all, to the pie that awaits us in the sky. And sometimes we just need to sit with the difficulty and the pain and that trouble, and just understand that might be part of our journey. And it certainly is part of the journey for many of the people in our churches, and not to rush by that, and just to acknowledge that, sit with it, and try to understand understand it a little bit, not just look for the silver linings in everything, but to understand those darker things as well. We're in the season of Easter. It's very tempting for us to just rush ahead and think everything's great, everything's good, new life has come, it's fantastic, and those things are all true, but they're not the entire truth of where our churches, where our people are at, where the communities around us are at as well. So not to despise the dark valleys, not to despise the stripes or the wounds, but to let those shine out perhaps as part of that path that we are on, a path to something better, yes, but we are on that path and we need to sit with those wounds sometimes and to just hear that cry of creation, hear that cry of the people who are being oppressed, hear those cries as well before we take our next step. Just sit with those and hear that, to be like that shepherd who listens out for the call of the sheep, I guess, if you want to bring it back to that metaphor. But there's so much more to it than that. But thank you, Liz. You've just dropped a truth bomb that I will be thinking about for the rest of today.
I mean, I was very much thinking, if you've got somebody within your, in front of you who is in the middle of one of those dark valleys, who has, who is in a job where they feel a slave to, or might be, a victim of sex trafficking, how would you, what would I be trying to say to that individual, that morning or evening? And I think because Peter puts it in the context of the suffering servant of Christ's crucifixion, that I suppose to use a theological kind of that substitutionary atonement kind of theology, what I'm trying to say, I guess, to that people, that person or that group of people, is that God sees you and knows you, that God is in this and has been through this. Um, and that you are valued and loved even though you are in some form of slavery. But then I was taken back to the Acts passage, which of
Mm.
course is about a a church family, a group of people who are a family together, sharing their time, talents, and resources for the common good. And actually, as we've talked about, Christian mission within our local communities, about sharing the things that we have in common for the good of others, that's exactly what is going on here as well. So actually, for the person in trapped in some form of slavery, whether it's a household slave in the first century AD or somebody who might be experiencing that today in Leicester, this, the good news is that you have Christian sisters and brothers who recognize that injustice, who are working to challenge that injustice, and are, with you in solidarity, and they want to walk with you and join with you to relieve you from that challenge. And that's the death and resurrection that we see at this Easter time, isn't it? So that's how I was sort of, wanted to kind of take that big challenge of particularly of slavery within the Peter passage and actually bring it back to what is going on in Acts, because those two things were happening simultaneously. There were household slaves within that first Christian church in those first heady days after Pentecost, and you can see then the outworking of that, of how the family of the church loved each other, loved God, and responded to God in both of these passages.
Mm, brilliant, thank you. I wanted to ask, I think maybe a question that straddles the 1 Peter and the Psalm. Verse 20 in 1 Peter, thinking about when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. We've talked about this a bit, but I wanted to ask specifically, what is our place? I think particularly, Liz, maybe as Western Christians, as you've talked about that international focus. What is ours to do? How do we kind of avoid glorifying suffering or martyrdom in a negative way, in a way that kind of doesn't fully understand or presumes that that's something that it is ours to do. But how do we also recognize that actually there are times when we have to have the sort of responsibility to say, this is going to be ours to do. We are going to, in some way, suffer. We're going to be unpopular. We're going to be countercultural. We're going to find it difficult. We're going to have financial burdens as well, perhaps. And yet, uh, be that sort of suffering servant in Christ. And that, I think, makes me think about the end of Psalm 23 as well, that dwelling in the house of the Lord, how does that connect to it? That's kind of the safety, there's protection, there's security. But there's also perhaps a bit of a fear of change or of strangers. You know, if we're in the house of the Lord, do we get a bit reactionary? Do we get a bit selfish? So how do we kind of put ourselves out there without kind of bunkering down the hatches? What do you think?
Well, that's a big and challenging question, isn't
I
it?
know.
I
That's why
think
I'm
my
asking it.
um, I think my response is when I've preached on creation care, sometimes I've said kind of something along the lines of, if as a Christian church we are committed to working towards net zero, to all of the things associated with caring for our creation, but also caring for those who are most affected by climate change, is actually, for those of us who live in Leicester in a relatively comfortable kind of position, is actually we have to accept that, we have sacrifices to make about the way we live our lives and the resources that we use. So actually, if we are, on a basic level, if we're committed to this, we need to turn the heating down a bit and feel a bit cold sometimes. I mean, that's quite a glib way of saying it, but it's that kind of commitment that actually Christians across the world, in whatever situation they find themselves in, whether that's, economic or others, we are called to make sacrifices and to kind of for the common good of creation, for the whole of humanity and for each other. Um, so I think, looking back at that, that particular verse, um, there's some in Peter, there's something about, our ability to be sacrificial in our giving. God gives us all these amazing, brilliant things about ourselves. She, in my context, gives me a nice house to live in, as a stipend to live off, and all of those sorts of things. And I find this really hard. And my spirit-filled response, with God's help, with her help, is to give back of that as generously as I can. And of course, it's not just about possessions and stuff, but it's also about the time I have, the resources I have, the talents that I have, the jam making I randomly do for my church, and stuff like that. So for me, um, you know, both of these passages, when we are blessed and given so much by God, to we give away because actually we don't need this stuff. God doesn't need it. And so, as we continue to have a closer and more deeper relationship with God and with our own community, our reaction is to give it, is to, give it and sacrificially give it, because that's the heart of our Christian community. And I find it really hard myself. It's all very well to preach it, but practicing it sometimes is tough as well. Um,
Mm,
so
yeah.
I guess that's how it feels to be, around God's table and in God's house, is that actually you need to be kind of, flinging all the stuff outside and getting everybody else in as well.
Great, thank you. Rue, and any reflections on that sort of topic or on the psalm in general before we move on to John?
Nope.
Great, let's do that. Um, Liz said it all. And we'll look at the gospel to conclude. Any initial reflections? And Rue, we'll start with you.
Well, the great verse here in John 10 is verse 10. You will find this pop up a lot in JPIT stuff, so Joint Public Issues team. We have some key verses that we keep coming back to because they're just useful for us to plant in our minds. It's a bit like when you were maybe at Sunday school or something as a kid. Those of us who experienced that joy growing up. you were given a memory verse to learn. So this is one of our key verses, our memory verses, is that Jesus comes that they may have life and have it abundantly. And that sense of abundant life is really important as well. The quality of life that Jesus offers to us. And we within JPIT don't just think that stops at people who are following Jesus, but for everyone. And it might not even just be everyone, it might be every creature as well. Can it extend to the whole of creation, that the whole of creation should be able to operate within that sense of abundance. We know that God's abundance is incredible. I'm going to tell you something which I don't know if it'll make the edit, to be honest, but in the church I used to work in a few years ago, one of our wonderful, wonderful folks, who was a member of the church, she only got to preach every so often, but when she did get to preach, oh boy, you always knew you were in for some treat. And she was talking about God's abundance and the joy of God's abundance. And one of the examples, I mean, she talked about, the seeds whenever you blow onto a dandelion clock and the seeds that get dispersed. And only some of those might, take and become a new plant. But there's just that sense of abundance and perhaps overabundance. And then she went to a place that probably no one was expecting. She talked about ejaculant. She talked about, whenever semen is produced, there's all these thousands of cells that could produce a new life, but perhaps only one is going to be successful. And you could just see people in the congregation going, oh my goodness, I wasn't expecting to hear that word. But it was just a joyful kind of exploration of the abundance of God in life, that not every little thing that can bear fruit will. Not every little seed will become something else. Some of them will just fall into the ground and that's it. That's the end of the journey. But that doesn't stop us celebrating the fact that that abundance allows life to function and to flourish. So that flourishing of all life is really important for us within GPIT and within Christianity as well, we think. And that's something we keep coming back to when it feels like people are being squashed and oppressed and limited in the things that they experience in life, whether it's through public policy, government suggestions and ideas, whether it's about how people are treated within their own community or within their own families or within their church. If anything is being squashed and that abundance is being squeezed out, we think, is that from God? Or are we looking for something more, that each person can live within that abundance and that flourishing? So that is the key verse for us, I suppose. The rest of the chapter I'll leave to Liz.
Thanks. Just what I wanted, the rest of the chat. Interestingly, I was also drawn to that particular verse. It's in our main hall in our diocesan offices, where very occasionally we all gather together. It's around one of the a little piece of stained glass window, those verses. But it's also really at the heart of some of the work that I do on the Diocesan Board of Education in Leicester, because our Church of England schools in my diocese, we have 23,000 children worshipping within their schools week by week. And of course, in Leicester, which is one of the global majority cities in England, of course, those schools are chosen not just necessarily by Christian families, but actually by families of faith and no faith. And we have this really radical, well, maybe not radical, but we have a policy within the Church of England, and particularly, I don't know whether it's our diocese or nationally, that actually, we don't discriminate on the basis of faith. So, it's not automatic that if you're a Christian, you should automatically go into a C of E school. But for me, and within the Diocesan Board of Education, when we talk about having life abundantly, we also recognise that while that is great and glorious and magical, and there's lots of it, actually, it also recognises that life in abundance is not necessarily always easy or straightforward, that there are moments of challenge and suffering, which is where we get straight back to Peter again, don't we? And also the valleys of death and fear that we found in Psalm. And so actually, on the Diocesan Board of Education, we really recognise that the life that the children have in abundance within their school, within their family, within their wider community, actually the abundance includes living in and through difficult times, and actually in how we respond as people of faith to that by recognizing that that is part, as we've already talked, part of being countercultural within our contemporary society, and also that life is hard and that being called to be Christians is not an easy journey. It's actually a journey that is challenging and sacrificial, is also part of that. So for me, it's understanding that abundance is both an amazing thing, but also can be a really challenging thing.
Mm. Thank you both. I'd like to just, for the last thing we discuss in this, might be verse 9. I was really struck by whoever enters by me will be saved and will come in and go out and find pasture or pasture. And it made me think, what does that mean? Pastures where animals graze, it's where they're sustained, where they're kept going. But it made me think about if you're in the winter and there's lots of rain, the conditions are very bad, the animals are in the barn, right? And it's only kind of in the spring, after the land's been renewed and it's kind of grown, it's been watered by the rains, that the animals can come and graze. So I think that is a word that I found very interesting that you might kind of have. Uh, Quite I don't know, it might pass you by, but if you look at it, that's really interesting, that what is the pasture is the kind of freedom in Christ, that there's a refreshment of the bond between us and God after perhaps maybe a long time of struggle or of difficulty, of not particularly feeling abundant in your own life, but recognizing that after that, there is actually a sense of freedom, the open field coming out of the kind of barn for the winter. So I really liked the way you talked about abundance kind of involving that trials of life. I think that's really true. Is there any other bit of a particular verse or particular word, perhaps that word pasture, that you'd like to reflect on before we close?
I mean, when I look at these sort of sheepy and shepherdy bits of scripture, I'm often drawn back to Kenneth Bailey's work, who he's an American theologian but has lived for donkey's years in different parts of the Middle East and the Holy Land. Rue's smiling, so maybe he's come across his work as well. And he talks about how this passage in John, the first 6 verses are about a model of shepherding where you live in your local village, and each morning you take your sheep from their overnight pen in the village up to the pastures. Whereas the second bit, sort of verses 7 to 9, are for those semi-nomadic shepherds who actually spend months and months and months following the pasture around. And at night, what they do is they put their sheep into like a little kind of stone enclosed wall, and they literally sleep across the entrance. So they are the gate to protect their sheep from thieves. But in both cases, it's the shepherd's job to, guide and those sheep to the pastures and to, protect them overnight from thieves and, in not in our context necessarily, but certainly in Palestine and Israel, from the wild animals that would have come to take off a tasty lamb to feed them. And so there's something really rather kind of beautiful about that symbolism of being cared for and protected, while also having that freedom to live, experience the joy of going out to pasture every morning and being set free every morning, whether you're in a village barn or whether you're in a little sheepfold high up in the mountains.
Mm, brilliant. Rue, any final thoughts or reflections?
Brilliant. Yeah, I think the message there for me is that there is enough. If we look, there are many curses of globalization and globalism, but one of them is that we have the ability to actually compute that there is enough resource in our beautiful, huge world for everyone and everything to live in abundance. And the issue has been that we have not believed that we have gathered into barns more than our fair share. And so that loops us back beautifully to the Acts, that the things that they held in common were for the good of those as they had need. And so if we can just tap into that, then our real realization of what abundance actually means is that it is not that we have more than other people, but that we all share in that wonderful abundance together. And those will be the right paths, I think, that we are led into. So that's where it all seals together and all heals together, in that sharing the great resource that God is giving so generously to us. We just need to follow the shepherd into that realization.
Thank you both. That's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Liz. And
Very
thank you
welcome.
very much, Rue. Yeah, thank you both for being welcome. And thank you, listeners, for listening. I hope that this episode helps you in your preaching prep. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review where you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms. And I'll leave you with a brief reflection in relation to one of our awareness days, International Workers' Memorial Day, which is set on this day, this week rather, on I believe the 26th. And that was set by the 28th, sorry. And that's set in relation to the American Workers' Health and Safety Act from 1970. I did a bit of a Google, and that's why it's that day. And I think it's really important to remember, especially those that have passed away in the course of their work. And the slogan is that they use for the day is "Remember the dead, fight for the living," which I thought was particularly prophetic in some ways. And I found a reflection from a man called Peter Torres Fremlin about the Rana Plaza collapse. That was in 2013, 12 years ago this week, very close to the day of memorial for workers who passed away. And he wrote a brief reflection as a member of the International Labour Organization who was there at the time and saw the devastation as over 1,000 people died in that collapse. Thought we'd use it as a prayer. It's called Prayer to Failure. Unclasp the armour on your heart. You put it on as protection from blows and blame. Forget your stories. Look again and realise that your work, even if you meant it, has come to nothing, maybe worse than nothing. You got close enough to injustice to make promises to fix it, but not close enough to keep them, not close enough to heal pain and broken lives. This is a prayer that failure will not take part of you forever, that your voice does not become too harsh or your heart too hard, that amid a place of stone, something can grow again. Amen.